OK, let's turn attention to the papers. As I said to you, Portia Berry-Kilby, political commentator, joins me now. Portia, good morning to you.
Morning, James.
Thank you very much indeed for coming in this morning. Now, you picked out some stories. We'll come to those very shortly. However, we must start with the front pages. And to the Times first, getaways at risk as chaos is blamed on airline cuts. All sorts of stories about this travel chaos. We'll talk about that story in a moment. Meanwhile, the Telegraph, police leave 999 callers hanging, all forces but one missed targets to answer phones in 10 seconds in the wake of the pandemic. We do have a problem with our emergency services, don't we? That for whatever reason, this ability to be able to get the emergency service to you when you need it quickly, for whatever reason, has come under pressure and no longer seems to be either achievable or achieved.
That's very much so, and I guess it's typical over bank holidays. You have more people needing the emergency services if they could just go a little bit too far with their drink. So who knows what this weekend will be like.
Do you think is it an organisational thing that we need to sort out, or is it a money thing that we need to pump more in to solve it?
I think often these things, it's organisational, it's efficiency. More money won't necessarily fix it if the system is broken.
Meanwhile, the Prime Minister urging councils to allow Jubilee parties. How on earth have we allowed ourselves to get into a situation where local authorities haven't given permission for parties? People seem to be having them, and we could have up to 4 million people breaking the law. That's a ridiculous state of affairs, particularly when we're celebrating a national event.
It is very much so, James. I think we could have more people break the law than abide by the law with their parties. And I guess one thing which is of concern if it's an unofficial party would be, say, the emergency services not being able to get through. But otherwise, it's very much harkening back to the days of COVID and people breaking the rules, but for doing something that's fairly normal, like having a celebration.
Interesting that the Prime Minister is leading the charge here. He has absolutely no form whatsoever in partying at all, and we haven't been discussing that in any shape or form, either on this radio station or indeed anywhere, talking about Prime Ministers and partying at all. In terms of what we should or could be doing, I mean, how important is this moment in the nation's history? Because the longer that this goes on and the sort of build-up continues, the more I realise that this is an extraordinary moment in this country's history, that we've talked about, for example, what did the Victorians do for us, and the huge amount of change over Queen Victoria's reign. And then we don't really talk about sort of other members of the royal family in terms of change. We'd sort of mention sort of like Edwardian architecture or sort of Georgian this or that. But generally speaking, Victorian is huge. And now we've got the second Elizabethan age, where the change has been monumental.
Mm. No, that's very true. And the Queen, the amount of changes she has seen in her life are massive. And I think it's unusual that when you have the majority of your population can only remember Queen Elizabeth being on the throne.
Will we be referred to as Elizabethans? Are we, you know, in 100 years' time, will they talk about, you know, because we talk about Elizabethans, but we talk about the first ones. What are we all going to be called?
We are Elizabethans.
Oh.
Maybe we might be the last, you know, monarchists, heaven forbid, but we are...
Do you think that, given the conduct of the next generations, do you think that the monarchy is in danger of surviving as an institution?
I think I'm quite hopeful. Maybe naively optimistic, but...
Can William save it?
I think Prince Charles could do a good job. I think people have low expectations, but we've yet to see it.
I think he's an incredible man. I think he's done some amazing work throughout his life. And I would hope that he's able to be a steady hand on the tiller, but I think it does actually come down to William, because I think regardless of whether Prince Charles is and becomes king, we all know that will be a relatively short reign as we prepare for perhaps a longer one. But also, I think until or unless we can have a longer reign by somebody, that's when the monarchy becomes stable. If you have this chopping and changing, then people can't really get into it.
I think perhaps, but I think you have to buy into the whole institution of monarchy. It's not just one person, there is something broader there.
But a lot of people really object to the idea that somebody can be born into a position of privilege, power and influence.
I mean, they can object as much as they like, but this is the system we have, and I think it's served us well this far.
OK, do you think it's any worse or better? OK, let's talk about... So, you're born Prince William, and you are going to be king. You're born a child of David and Victoria Beckham. You are going to be famous. It's kind of... There are some people who will be born into extremely fortunate situations. What they do with that is up to them. But if anybody is under any illusion that some people will not be born into something that's more, or a position that's more fortunate than others, think again.
Well, entirely, absolutely. And I think with this, you have the old idea of, like, noblesse oblige, and with, like, this...
The what?
Noblesse oblige. So with, like, this nobility comes obligation. You have duty.
I'll get a translator in.
It's too early, maybe. And I think people kind of write it off as, oh, you're royal, you have all this money, what a great life. But there's a lot that goes with that. There's
a lot of responsibility and a cake as well. Anyway, let's talk about some of the other front pages. The Mirror, half of the page is devoted to Her Majesty and Me, the ultimate Jubilee party guide, but also Summer of Chaos, they say, fears the airport queues crisis is here to stay for months. We'll talk about the story in a moment. Meanwhile, Prime Minister's sudden lurch to the right fuels anger of Tory rebels. Do you think the Prime Minister has lurched to the right?
I mean, when I read this headline, I was like, what are they talking about? And apparently just kind of raising the idea of imperial measurements, that is something that of a lurch to the right, and doing away with more EU restrictions is a lurch to the right, and perhaps bringing back grammar schools, which is an old idea that comes up every time there's an issue in the Conservative Party, to kind of get a bit more hope amongst the more conservative voters. I don't really know if we can describe it as a lurch to the right. This seems very much a Guardian headline, going a bit doolally.
It is going a little bit doolally. Meanwhile, The Guardian focuses inside on the G2. How about this? Has the Heartstopper generation won the battle for LGBTQ plus equality? Do you think that programmes like this, here we are, we've got a sort of big spread all about this programme, where they talk about, this is a programme on TV, Heartstopper, giving queer characters a happy ending, football has a new hero too. Is this a turning point for LGBTQ plus kids? I kind of think it is, actually. That I think it's becoming so as minor an issue, because people are so used to the fact that, funnily enough, some children will be gay, some will have different kinds of relations, some will have, and yet it's the older generations that really struggle. They really struggle with sexuality. They really struggle with people having gender discussions and all the issues that go with it. And we've got a story that you've picked out that we'll come to in a moment, which kind of exemplifies that. The younger generation are pretty sorted, aren't they?
I think a lot of the younger generation think this is, like, totally normal, and it has been normalised. I think nowadays, how common is it for someone to be in the closet, so to speak, about their sexuality? Not very likely.
Unless they are a significant sports star.
Well, perhaps, but he still came out fairly young, at a young age, and there's always that, I don't think you should be 12 years old and be like, I am gay or straight. You're 12 years old at that point. I think there comes a point when you are being more of a sexual being, shall we say, and that is only natural that it comes when you're in your later teens or at around that age. I don't think that's them feeling uncomfortable in their own skin.
Indeed, and look, I think it's an interesting time, but I think that battle has certainly made a lot of progress. Probably still some more to be made, but no, maybe not as much as perhaps 10, 15, 20 years ago was required. Now, the newspaper, one Jubilee guide to rule them all. Superfans start gathering at the palace. What's wrong with these people? I mean, look, I'm all up for celebrating Her Madge, but I mean, sitting outside and camping. I mean, nobody wants to have somebody. I mean, it's going to smell. Somebody's been there for 4 days sitting outside the palace. Oh.
It's going to... I saw all of the Portaloos around. You know, they're going to be groggy after a few days, even after a few hours in London.
No wonder they lock themselves up in the palace. Absolutely hideous. Anyway, the Sun newspaper focuses on Andy Carroll didn't score as usual. They say this is a story. But also, don't rain on her parade. This is talking about the Sun photographer's plea. And this is actually to Harry and Meghan. I think Harry and Meghan have finally realised that if they're not part of the royal family, so hence them renewing the lease on Frogmore Cottage, if they're not part of the royal family and doing things with the royal family, then they're of no interest to anyone.
I think that's very true, and it's all very much defined in opposition to the royal family, but still having to be sufficiently involved to be able to voice that opposition.
Meanwhile, the Daily Star, wish you were anywhere but here. Huge queues, missed flights, no luggage. We'll talk about that story next, because it's also on the front page of the Daily Express. Tears and fury as travel carnage worsens. Right, we will come to that story and all the rest of the stories that Portia's picked out for us from the papers in just a few moments' time. This is Talk TV. just meanwhile going through the papers with Portia Berry-Kilby, political commentator from Young Voices. Now, Portia, let's take a look at the Daily Express, but this is a story on many of the papers. We have... It says tears and fury as travel carnage worsens. Many of the papers focusing on the huge queues, the difficulty. I mean, who are we blaming for this?
Well, I think we are blaming the airlines, but the airlines are blaming the airports, the Lib Dems are blaming the government, and then the government is blaming the airlines. So everyone's pointing the finger at a different person or entity, and no one's really giving an answer.
So we've got a perfect blame storm.
It's wonderful, yes. It's a full circle.
For anybody who's thinking about going on holiday, frankly, the amount it costs, I would be thinking very carefully about whether or not I go on holiday. I would be thinking, you know what, I think I want to do a staycation or take the car or get on a ferry. I do not want to go on a plane. The last time I went on a plane, one journey was fine. The one coming back, we were at an airport in France and it was absolutely hideous. I mean, there were queues out the door, there were, arguments and sort of poor management. So it's not just a British problem here. We have problems at airports around the world and airlines around the world. You've got situations with some airlines still asking you to wear face masks, which is a ghastly thing, others not. I mean, you name it, it's a right old mess. Travel is going to be a mess for at least 12 to 18 months, isn't it?
Very likely. And I think there's one union of the aviation industry, as they call themselves, which says they might have a strike during the summer over wages for airline staff. So just as you've got bad clocks now, it's going to be even busier, I think, in the height of summer.
Meanwhile, let's talk about a story which appears in today's Times newspaper. The BBC changed the testimony of a rape victim after a debate over pronouns of her transgender attacker, according to the Times. This is the story that seems to garner and create the biggest backlash of any kind of story that one can discuss. And it's also, it is quite often sort of age-related as well, because the younger you are, the less likely you are to go with the older person's narrative.
I guess that's somewhat fair, but I think what's interesting in this story is that they changed a rape victim's testimony of what happened, and she described the attacker as him, and they changed it in the article to they, and apparently the BBC's guidelines, they will change a quote to help clarity and for the audience, for the reader. But this, I don't know if that necessarily helps to give clarity. It might be deemed more fair by some groups by using preferred pronouns, but at the same time, if it's a they attacking you, it's unclear. Maybe it was multiple rapes.
But if somebody refers to themselves as they, then isn't that the right way to refer to somebody, regardless of how the victim refers to them?
Well, I don't think then you should doctor a victim's quote, because the victim still said it, and the victim referred to her attacker as him and a man attacking her, and why should the BBC then police what a victim is saying for their sensitivities?
But then isn't this the bigger problem, which is that we have a real problem in our society in terms of how we are defining people and how we are referring to people, and that for a very small number of people, the definitions that we have of either he or her, if you like, isn't suitable.
And that is for a very small number, and they identify as something else. That doesn't mean that you should enforce someone to describe that person as a man if they were born female, but then now say, oh, my gender pronouns are he, him. I think if someone in a quote refers to that person as whatever they refer to them, you should be honest to that quote. And it's kind of sealing the debate as closed if the BBC then uses their editorial guidelines to correct that.
I kind of see the BBC side on this, in the sense that what they're trying to do is they're trying to navigate that. On one hand, I totally accept if somebody says something, then and you decide to quote it, then arguably you need to quote it as they said it, or to highlight that you have changed it. And if you have changed it because you have decided that this is how somebody needs to be referred to, or they refer to themselves in a slightly different way, the question is, who has precedence over how somebody is referred? Is it the person who is accusing somebody, or is it the person themselves to say that they self-identify? To be honest, it's such a minefield that My only problem with all of this is that we don't seem to be able to have proper conversations without one side or the other jumping and hijacking the conversation, and then it becoming so toxic that then most what I would describe as reasonable people refuse to discuss it and think about it and talk about it, because they just say, oh no, it's too toxic, I can't go anywhere close to that.
It is very toxic, but I think there is something to be said when you have the BBC giving a rapist the benefit of the doubt as to their pronouns rather than the rape victim.
The BBC love getting themselves into difficulty and knots, and long live the BBC for that. Meanwhile, I can just lighten the load slightly on the basis that if you want to buy an Aston Martin DB5, there is one available for sale. This particular one used to belong to James Bond. It was used in the 1964 film Goldfinger, when many fans dreamt of owning a car fitted with the devices that this one had, an ejector seat on the gear stick to launch the would-be assassin into the air, all sorts of other things, I think some rocket launchers and various other things. The Aston Martin DB5 that's Sean Connery bought so that he could drive one not weighted down by gadgets is to be sold at auction. It could fetch, £1.5 million. Might leave that one until the next time, but there we go. Lovely picture of it in today's Times newspaper on the same page. I would avoid the alter gender discussion on the lower half of that page. Just have a look at the Aston. Far easier and less controversial. Let's talk about the Daily Telegraph, though. Don't over-egg the Queen in the pageant, says the Palace. What on earth are they going on about? What are we doing?
So this is apparently to cater to more Republican sensibilities, that you don't make the pageant for the Jubilee all about the Queen. Apparently it has to be about the royals more broadly, or about what the royals can give back to the people of the UK.
No, that's daft, because it is celebrating the Queen, and frankly, if you delve into the history of any of the other royals, you've got a right old mess. and you know, you start talking about Harry and Meghan, no thanks. You start talking about Andrew, way back again, oh no. I mean, this is a disaster. Talk about Her Majesty the Queen. She's the only one that doesn't have any problems attached.
Well, exactly. And they say it has to be somewhat self-deprecating, and there has to be humour in the pageant, which are very British things anyway, and I'm sure it will have humour in regardless. But the idea that you're policing how much someone can glorify Her Majesty seems a bit absurd. And apparently the word pageant is loaded and has connotations, and they're working to reframe that for...
Yes, I have to say pageant, I think they could have come up with a better name for it. Anyway, meanwhile, let's go to your favourite paper. I'm sure it's in The Guardian. This is a story also that reaches the front page of the Times as well. This is about a cake. The French are really good with cake, and they ended up with a problem with the Mona Lisa.
They did indeed. So a man guised as woman, apparently, by wearing a wig and using a wheelchair that he didn't need, got to the front of the queues and got up, punched the Mona Lisa painting and smeared cake all over the screen.
And that's because there is glass on the front of it to protect it, and decided. Finally, Portia, what was the reason for the protest?
For climate, because apparently apparently artists always talk about saving the climate, and that is apparently what he was doing.
Okay, well done him. Portia, if people want to find out more about you or Young Voices or indeed anything else, where do they go?
If you type in Young Voices on Twitter, you either get Acquire or Young Voices Political Commentary Organisation, and it's the latter one. There we go. Portia Berry-Kilby, political commentator. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, going through the papers here on TalkTV.